Good afternoon, Chairman.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone present in the Chamber and those listening online at Lincolnshire County Council Pensions Committee. My name is Councillor Condell and I am the Chairman of this committee. Deputy Chair today is Councillor Roberts. Can I remind those in attendance that the audio-visual feed of this meeting is being broadcast live via the Council website. I'll try to ensure that all members have the opportunity to ask questions and make contributions today. And we will now move on to the formal agenda. Apologies for absences.
Thank you, Chairman. We have apologies from Councillor Hastings, Councillor Woods and Tom Hotchin.
Just, did the committee need to appoint the chairman, vice chairman? Procedurally, I've got no problem with it.
I will check because I don't. Do we need to appoint a vice chair?
We can do, yes, just for this meeting only.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Hill. At this point in time, I will request that someone nominate Councillor Roberts.
Councillor Roberts.
Seconded.
Thank you, Helen.
Thirded.
Oh, thank you, Councillor. Thank you very much for that. All in favour? You're in. Thank you. Can we move on to declaration of members' interests? Steve?
Thank you, Chairman. As a deferred and active member of the Pension Fund.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The normal one, I'm a pensioner now. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair?
I'm an active member.
Thank you. Move on to item 3, minutes of the previous meeting. This is to approve the minutes of the last meeting as a correct record. Does anyone have any points of accuracy on it? If not, can I have a proposer? Councillor Brockway. A seconder? Councillor Roberts. All in favour? Those against? Any abstentions? Okay, so we'll move on to item 4, Independent Advisors Market Update Report. Paul Watson, the Independent Advisor, to present a report, and then we'll invite members to speak or ask questions.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. We're on page 14 of the pack, and I'll talk through the market performance table. Just as a reminder for members, this section is to briefly cover kind of the market environment. Later on in the meeting, we'll be covering the individual fund performance. But in brief, it's been a very good environment in markets for the fund. You'll see on the table that equity markets, which make up around 50% of our holdings in public equities, a very strong quarter to the end of September for equities. If you just look at the MSCI All Country World Index, which is a good proxy for global equities, that's up almost 10% in the period. Within that, we've also seen some regional differences, strong performance from North America and emerging markets, and slightly behind for the UK. That's really driven by the makeup of the UK index. Within styles, it was quite a good period for growth style stocks. That would mean things like the AI-driven stocks had a particularly good quarter this time, and we might pick up that later on when we look at some of the individual fund performance. But essentially, it was good corporate earnings being announced in the period, some AI momentum in terms of some of those stocks, and some civility in terms of some of the tariff discussions going on. So I say a good environment there for equity markets, and hence good for the fund, given our allocation to public equities. On bonds, it was fairly modest. You'll see there kind of minus 0.6% for the UK government gilt index. Obviously, there has been some movement since the end of September, given we had the budget coming in November. I'll touch on that briefly in a moment. but not a lot going on in the bond assets. In terms of other assets, probably worth noting, it was a good period for particularly gold and silver, which we draw out in the narrative. And in terms of currency, we did see sterling lose a little bit of value in the quarter, so down about 2% against the dollar, for example. Just in terms of what's been happening since the end of September, essentially it's been a similar story for equities. We've seen some small but positive performance coming through from the end of September, which will obviously be additional to this performance at the end of September, which has been good. So we did have some slight bond market volatility around the budget, but that was very modest, certainly compared to 3 years ago when we had the budget then. So very modest movement in gilt yield, and bonds are broadly flat through the period. So that was all I was going to cover in terms of a broad market outlook, but happy to take any questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Paul? No? Thank you. Since there's no questions, is everybody okay to consider the report and agree with it? Okay. We'll move on to item 5, the Stewardships Update Report. Claire will be going through this and then we will take questions.
Thank you. So the report brings to the committee details of the fund's stewardship activity during the second quarter of the financial year. And it has a recommendation that the committee consider, report and discuss the stewardship activity undertaken. Through our stewardship activity as a fund, we're wanting to ensure that the investments that we hold are being well managed and are performing well. Information on the engagement and voting activity from LAPF, Border to Coast, Robeco and Morgan Stanley have been included within the report this quarter and are supported by a number of links throughout the report which provide further information to members of the committee. Sections 2 to 5 of the report set out the engagement activity for the quarter and in summary highlighting LAPF have continued their dialogue and engagement in sectors including cement suppliers when considering decarbonisation strategies and with food and beverage companies for their water risk and water stewardship. Border to Coast have continued to vote at company AGMs during the quarter and have spent time reflecting on and following up on with companies from the peak voting season which was seen in the previous quarter. And this has led to a number of positive interactions and meetings following those AGM votes. And there's more information included within the paper and with the links to documents which can be found on the Border to Coast website. Section 6 looks specifically at voting during the quarter and the report details the activity across the 4 Border to Coast equity sub-funds. And it highlights instances where votes have been cast against management recommendations and it includes also that link to Border to Coast website where there's lots of detail on the individual votes and why those votes have been cast and how. Section 7 sets out the ESG and carbon reporting for the Border to Coast sub-funds that we're invested in, and the table summarises the performance of those funds during this quarter and the previous quarter to give some context to it. And finally, Section 8 of the report covers the Stewardship Code. The fund has submitted its code to the Financial Reporting Council for 24-25, and this was by the deadline at the end of October. A copy of that document is attached at Appendix A to the report, and we expect feedback from the FRC in spring 2026, and this will be shared with the committee once it's been received. And again, just for some context, the fund has been a signatory of the new Stewardship Code from its introduction in 2020. And I'm very happy to take any questions on the report.
Are there any questions? Councillor Hill?
Yeah, just a couple. I don't know whether you can answer what the issue with Coca-Cola is that was referred to in the second one. And the policy engagement, well, whilst in agreeing with some of the comments on the UK Sustainability Reporting Standards consultation. What difference does that make to anything, really?
I think probably in terms of both of those examples, the best thing we could do is take them away and share with you the underlying information from the Coca-Cola example is from the LAP work that they've been doing during the quarter, and then from the border to coast work to give you some more details on that, and then can share with you. Yeah, we'll take those away and we can provide more information on those, and we'll share those in a weekly update in the next couple of weeks.
Councillor Bunny?
Thank you. We were talking earlier on about how the world is changing in its approach to climate change and also to an extent net zero. And I was just wondering where we got Coca-Cola, which seems to be making some sort of changes on those areas. Is that the case for other companies as well, do you know? Certainly in the academic world, there seems to be a shift towards the future of the planet as opposed to the dangers of climate change. And I'm just wondering if that's going to have some effect on how these companies respond in future.
Certainly the water risk and water stewardship has been quite a long-term engagement activity for LAP. So Coca-Cola and some of those companies will be the companies that they're targeting at the moment. We've seen previously some fast food companies and food producers where they've been leading that engagement. So they will target that. Their targeting of companies is based on the holdings that we have, but also on that long-term engagement with companies. So they'll focus on holdings that we have across all LAP members, and also with, I guess, companies which they think are laggards in that area.
And if I can just add a bit more onto what Claire has said. Obviously, we've talked before about TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures. One that runs alongside that is picking up more pace is the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosures. So all companies are now having to look at the nature risks alongside the climate risk, and just all of these various things, say like water scarcity, those other things that Claire has mentioned that could be a risk to a company's long-term sustainability. So I think we will see more of that as the TNFD gets wider spread, and there's a new one that's coming out, the Task Force for, I think it's Inclusion and Social Diversity Financial Disclosures, that is very, very new. So there's lots of, from the presentation earlier, you know, sometimes it is just the policy and regulatory environment that is making companies look at some of these things a bit differently. So obviously, as and when we have to do things and report on those, we will do as a fund.
Councillor Hill?
Yeah, on page 48, obviously Principle 7, there's a paragraph there which states the core policy explains the fund seeks to systematically integrate stewardship and investment to fulfil its responsibilities. The committee believes that as long-term investors, integrating environmental, social and corporate governance considerations into the investment management process improves risk-adjusted returns and creates long-term sustainable investments. So what evidence is there that the risk the returns are improving? Is that just an opinion, or is there any facts to back that up?
This is similar to a question that Paul asked earlier, actually, of border to coast. I think, you know, it's really the same response in that it's much easier to see when things go wrong, when that risk isn't considered. You know, there are various company examples of where they haven't had appropriate corporate governance, you know, Enron, where they haven't looked after their staff. I'm trying to think of some names. A clothing company, and it's gone straight out of my head, but there are lots of examples of where they haven't taken account of those principles, that they have lost money, you know, share price halved, etc. So and that narrative comes from one of the current investment beliefs that the committee previously have agreed that they do believe that considering those ESG factors should improve. I think it's very hard to say, because it's very often not down to just one individual thing. I mean, we can take that away and see. I know there has been some work done to try and identify kind of that ESG premium. So we can take that away and ask Border to Coast if they can find something to share with us that we can then share with the committee on that. But so it's very hard to pinpoint it, but there is a general belief across the industry that actually, you know, do you want to, you know, if the council was not well governed, would it be spending its money appropriately? So it's kind of more along those lines.
I think I was referring to the ESG. I think the governance is relevant, but
ESG is governance as well.
It's the opinion of the committee looking carefully at ESG improves returns. So what I'm asking for, on what evidence, because there may be a ESG premium, but there could equally be an ESG penalty. So all the question I'm only asking is, on what evidence base are they making this statement?
And I can see if I can find it, but say that was the opinion of the investment committee when we created the investment beliefs. Obviously, we had the discussion in November about the investment philosophy, which will replace the existing investment
we just
beliefs.
want an evidential. Their opinion is based on what?
Based
and I'm only asking you to find out
as I say, and it's more the danger that it isn't followed. And I say governance is part of ESG. It's a vital part of ESG. ESG isn't a thing that's standalone. It's about well-run.
Well, no, the reference in that is
and
ESG.
And when this was done, that was probably the more common terminology that was used. So I think if we were to rephrase that now, it would be very different. But absolutely, we can take that away and see. There has definitely been some papers done on about long-term the premium of investing in well-run companies across the E, the S and the G.
ESG stands for environment, social and governance. So it does cover that. But I do understand what you're saying. If we could get some data, it would be nice. Sorry, Steve?
Thank you, Chairman. Page 39's got the structure. I know I've asked this question previously. Is there a timescale around that vacant post and when that will be recruited to, of the principal accountant?
Yeah, we went out to market, I think it was 2 years ago, for 2 posts. Josh was appointed at that point in time. Because we're doing accountancy training, so the sit for training, I think we wouldn't want to look to appoint again until Josh was nearly completed with that training. It's been a little bit of an eye-opener, if I'm perfectly honest, to me, quite the commitment that was 25 years ago when I did it. It was a little bit different. So, I think because it's in some quite intense periods of time when you're away from work for multiple days a week, we would want Josh to be nearly finished with that training before we look to take on a second person.
Councillor Brockway? Sorry, Councillor Brockway, did you have a question? Okay. If there's if there's no further questions, then I propose that this recommendation, or that we recommend the report. Is there a proposer? Councillor Bunny? Seconder? Councillor Redfern? All for? Thank you. We'll move on to item 6, Border to Coast Responsible Investment Policy, Corporate Governance and Voting Guidelines and Climate Change Policy Annual Review. We had a talk with Tim this morning on responsible investment. And we're going to hear now from Jo.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So this paper brings the annual review of the Border to Coast policies covering responsible investment, corporate governance and voting guidelines, and climate change, with the recommendations being that the committee consider and endorse the proposed border to coast responsible investment policy, the corporate governance and voting guidelines, and the climate change policy, and also agree to align the Lincolnshire RI policy and corporate governance and voting guidelines to those of border to coast. Obviously, we don't have a Lincolnshire pension fund climate policy ourselves. So, as the Chairman just said, Tim Manuel, Head of Responsible Investment at Border to Coast, covered the policy review process at the training this morning and some background into the changes, and also explained that the annual review for the RI and climate change policies would be moving to a 3-year cycle. Following on from that chaining, this paper then just sets out the minor changes in Appendix A that have been made across each policy, set out in the report in sections 3, 4 and 5 for the 2026 review. These policies get taken to all of the Border to Coast partner funds for their endorsement and will go live at the beginning of January, ahead and in time for the peak voting season. So each fund is required to have an RI policy, and the Lincolnshire policies covering RI and corporate governance and voting guidelines will get amended to reflect these minor changes in the Border to Coast policies. So I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Any questions? Councillor Hill?
Just briefly, just can you explain this exclusion, change of exclusion policies or whatever that means?
I haven't opened the document that is attached to, but basically the exclusion policy is that if after periods of engagement, then there is an option to be able to exclude. There are very few exclusions that are such as the controversial weapons that was mentioned this morning. There's very few exclusions like that, but also it's a recommendation for exclusion, and the decision on that is actually always made by the investment team, because at the end of the day it's about the investment, and this is an additional layer of due diligence that's done on the companies looking at the responsible investment side, but there isn't a whole-scale exclusion policy against anything like, for example, fossil fuel, as was mentioned earlier.
So is it right to say then, before a company or sector is excluded, it has to go through further governance procedures? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. So it would be put forward as a recommendation from the RI team with the detail behind that. The investments team would then look at that with all the other factors that they look at, be it their report and accounts, all the normal investment research that is done to see, does that risk that's been identified in the RI team mean that actually they are concerned then about the investment case for that company?
Any additional questions? Okay, thank you. The recommendation asks that we consider and endorse a proposed Border to Coast responsible investment policy, corporate governance and voting guidelines, and climate change policy, and that we agree to align Lincolnshire's RI policy, corporate government and voting guidelines to Border to the Coasts. Do I have a proposer? Thank you. Councillor Redfern. Seconder? Councillor Roberts. All in favour? That's everyone. Sorry. Any against? Any abstain? Sorry? Abstention. We'll move on to item 7, consideration of exempt information. I move that under section 100A4 of the Local Government Act 1972, the public and press be excluded from the meeting for the following items of business, on the grounds that it involves a likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in paragraph 3 of part 1 of the schedule 12A of the Act. Do I have a seconder? Steve Larter. All for? Any against? Any abstentions? No. Thank you. Move on to the Sorry, we'll wait for it to be turned off.